Okay, joining us now is the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, live from Tamworth. Thanks for joining us, Barnaby.
You're welcome, Chris. My pleasure, mate.
Look, I want to come to some broader issues later on and talk about your campaign to hold the seat of New England, of course. But first up, a couple of issues in your agriculture portfolio, I suppose. And the one that's prominent in a lot of people's minds around the country now is the crisis for our dairy farmers and for our milk industry. They're very, very tough on the farmers, of course, with prices being reduced and the effect of that being retrospective, really, extremely difficult for farmers. But is there any role for government in this crisis? Isn't it just a matter of supply and demand?
No, I believe there is a role for government, and we're making sure we're playing that role now, making sure that farm household allowance, which is a payment of around about $1,000 a fortnight for a couple on the farm, that we can get that through to them. That allows them to keep the dignity in their lives, keep the groceries on the table, at least keep some of the wolves from the door. The next thing is making sure that the rural financial counsellors, that we can concentrate that resource to assist these farmers during this crisis. It's a crisis for them. They're below, some of them below the cost of production now. The next one is, and we were discussing with the Labor Party about concessional loans, trying to change the criteria of drought loans so that they also take into account this dairy crisis. And this is what concessional loans is what the industry has asked us for. It gives them more alternatives so that they can basically take out the debt that Murray Goulburn has crystallised against them and say, well, we'll look after that separately. Now if you can just start paying us the proper price or a more appropriate price for our milk, because they're taking the loan off the milk payment. And this means for some of them they've gone from 42 cents down to 14 cents a litre. And if I did that to your pay packet tonight, Chris, or to mine, we would have major problems in our house. Remember that farmers don't get, because of their asset level, it's more difficult for them to get unemployment benefits. That's why we have this farm household allowance process to try and assist them to get some sort of social security safety net into their lives. And I know that there's no systemic problem in the dairy industry over the long term. We have a trajectory up around about 1 or 2% per year, but we have a culmination of factors that have brought this about. We have basically milk prices were good and a lot of opportunity suppliers came into the market once milk solids went over 600 cents. We also had the Russia-Ukraine thing, and of course that brought about trade embargoes and the loss of one of the major markets for dairy product, and also the removal of the quota system in Europe. So people tried to fix their problem by producing more milk and really exacerbated the problem over there. So we're dealing with all this. This will all flow through and things will get back to an even keel. But we want to make sure that our dairy producers are there at the end. We've also been working with the supermarkets, and I'm glad to see that Coles has put an extra 20 cents a litre on their milk, and that'll go back to the farmers. I call on the other milk retailers to do the same, because it is ridiculous that you go in and buy a bottle of water and it's cheaper than a bottle of milk.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Bottle of milk. You've got to get farmers, they get up first thing in the morning, milk the cows, do the silage, do the mechanics, and milk them again in the evening. They have very long days, 365 days of the year, and to go into a shop and see that a bottle of water is cheaper than the bottle of milk does raise serious questions.
The measures you're talking about, though, are largely, for want of a better term, welfare measures or support measures to help farmers get through a difficult period. You seem to be suggesting that the supply and demand problem here, the pricing problem, will work through the system, whereas others are suggesting a greater government intervention. Nick Xenophon, for instance, is talking about imposing a milk levy and having an inquiry into the dairy industry. Is there any merit in any of those sorts of interventions?
They want us to move right now. That's presupposing that we wait around and have an inquiry. What are we going to do at the end of the inquiry? Probably the measures we're bringing about right now. Now, we've got to move now. We're moving right now, and I know other people are sort of jumping into that space because that's where the political lights are shining. But I've spent last week down in Victoria talking to the dairy farmers, and I was keeping close contact with them as we try to do what we can to alleviate the situation. I acknowledge that it is not the magic wand that we're going to make the situation disappear or better overnight, but we'll try and alleviate the situation and make sure that these farmers, which are great for our economy, great for their district, great for especially Victoria and Tasmania and Western Australia and everywhere else that they've got dairy farms, that they're there so that when this problem works its way through, they're up and running again.
Are the major supermarkets doing our dairy farmers in? Are they using milk as a loss leader to get people into their supermarkets?
Well, you know, I have a real problem with $1 a litre milk. I mean, it's really just there to get you in. The people who are paying for that are the dairy farmers. So there's no trick to this. You go in to buy your milk and think, oh, that's sweet, and you know, how could they do it so cheap? Well, they don't. The people who do it cheap are the farmers who supply it. They're the ones doing it cheap, but you should give credit where credit is due. It was not good that we had $1 a litre milk. It is good that one of them, Coles, is saying, well, we'll put 20 cents a litre on because we'll try and put our shoulder to the wheel on this problem. You know, other people are cynical about it. I'm not. I always congratulate people who start moving in the right direction, and I'll try and encourage them as much as I can for the others, you know, for the Woolies and Audi to do the same.
OK, we're in the, of course, election caretaker period, and you are working on measures on this industry. Are you therefore talking to your Labor counterpart, Joel Fitzgibbon, who's the agriculture spokesman for Labor? He's in the neighbouring electorate to you. You can wander down the road and maybe put something together with him. Do you have to do that?
Yeah, I've sent a letter off to Joel. He sent a reply back. It's sort of the standard fare that happens in politics where they say, you know, we agree with you, but, you know, you should have had more detail or whatever. But I do, you know, once more, credit's due. They say they want to work with us to bring about a solution in this, and I think that's good, even in the midst of this political campaign, that people just a little bit put things aside and try and make sure we bring about a resolution. That's what you expect the two parties that could possibly have government, the Liberal Party and the National Party, or the Labor Party, and I don't know how they work themselves out with the Greens, but you can discuss that they they actually talk as if they're a government and talk about solutions rather than just throwing bricks, because those people down there in Victoria and Tasmania, they want to hear you moving towards a solution, not throwing rocks at one another.
Well, staying in the agriculture area, of course, the agricultural sector in Australia needs massive investment if it's going to leverage up to take opportunities, export opportunities, particularly into Asia and for food products in coming years. And of course, to get that massive investment, we need foreign investment. I'm presuming that you would agree with that, and I just wonder how we're going to attract increasing foreign investment into our agricultural industries when we've stiff-armed, waved off this latest bid by the Chinese interest to take over the Kidman Pastoral Company.
Well, I find it funny, Chris, that when you say no to one, people presume it's no to everything. No, we have massive foreign investment in this nation. In fact, we are a more liberal nation than any other nation on earth. Remember, China doesn't allow you to buy land in China, or the Koreans to buy land in Korea, or the Japanese to buy land in Japan, or states in the United States, or New Zealand to the extent we do, or local government authorities in Europe. And I do find it a little bit annoying that when this nation, as it's right, says no to a deal, people all jump up and down because they say, how dare you say no to anything? Don't you know you should be saying yes to every deal that's ever put up before you?
My question isn't...
We've got to know how to say yes, and we've got to have the right and the strength and the ability to say no. And we have my mother-in-law says I can't point, so we have foreign investors lined down the road, round the corner, up the hills and far away, still wanting to buy land in our nation. And the Australian people, your listeners, have a right to believe that we are not just a anything goes type, that we have the capacity to say yes, and we do, and we have the capacity to say no, and every now and then we do that as well. And if Ernest & Young and other people get terribly upset because in one instance someone says no, well, tough luck.
But just briefly, the point though is that do you believe that, and it sounds like you don't, that this dissuades other investors? There's still plenty lining up and you want them coming in?
You always want straight answers, so I'm going to give you one. The answer to your question is no, it won't.
Good.
And the reason I base that on is because we've got investors everywhere. They're lined up, they're everywhere. So don't worry about foreign investors still wanting to buy Australian farmland. Believe you me, it is a case that there are, even around here, where we are, out in the dark there, there's heaps of, there's country just up the road here has been bought by the Chinese. There's country over there, tens of thousands of acres have been bought by the Chinese. In St George, I think you'll find around about 2/3 to 3/4 of the irrigation land, if you go between Dirranbandi, I suppose up towards Surat, is foreign owned. So don't give me this tripe that we are discouraging foreign investment. You know,
I thought
look
for a
at the
moment there
reality.
you were going to use another word other than tripe, but I want to move on to some broader issues here under, I suppose, as Deputy Prime Minister, and I want to talk about the latest development in the often emotional debate about border protection policy and refugees. And there's been the intervention today by Tim Costello, the head of World Vision, where he's actually used the word torture quite advisedly when he's talked about the way Australia is treating people on Nauru and Manus Island. Have a listen to what Tim Costello had to say.
There's no question that the psychological torture of not being able to actually resettle and you can't go back home is torture. You know, a Somalian woman who set herself on fire in Nauru. Now, World Vision works in Somalia. 98% of women suffer female genital mutilation. Somalia is a terrifying place. You would flee that. I would flee that. And the thought of that young woman of desperation, indefinite stay in Nauru, can't go back to Somalia, set herself on fire. That's the psychological torture that I think is going on.
Tim Costello on Sky there earlier today. Barnaby, Joyce, should he be using a word like torture? It is an extremely difficult situation, obviously, for refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah, well, Chris, it is a difficult situation, but it's a difficult situation in which is very difficult to manage. And of course, I'll go through two scenarios here. I'll tell you what is also torture is when someone is in a boat that sinks and they are in the water watching their children and their wife drown. I think that is also up there with torture. We don't know how many people drowned. We presume about 1,200. If tomorrow there was an accident in Australia and 1,200 people were killed, it would be an absolute outrage. It would demand every type of commission that ever been thought, and rightly so. We have to make difficult decisions so that it doesn't happen. We don't revel in them, but we have to make the difficult decisions. And the next thing is, I acknowledge Tim Costello. Yes, the world is full of terrible things happening, not just in Somalia, but in Nigeria, in Chad, in a whole range of places. In Nigeria, we could go through it, but as much as we would love to, we can't just say, well, the door is open and as many who would like to come here can turn up tomorrow, because we would lose the respect and control of the issue, and the Australian people would overwhelmingly turn against us because they would feel that we'd lost control of our borders. We can't let that happen.
But you do need to resettle those people who are on Manus and Nauru now, some of whom have been there for nearly 3 years.
Well, we have to stick to the principle that that we are the most generous nation, or one of the most generous nations per capita on earth, right? So let's not chide ourselves that we're not putting our shoulder to the wheel on this. We do, but we must do it on our terms. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes ridiculous. And therefore, to do it on our terms says you have to come through the appropriate channels. That is, we find you overseas and bring you in with the proper process, not by the process of people either making their own arrangements or paying a people smuggler to basically paying money to a criminal to try and make their own way here, because if we allow that business plan to get started again, there is no end to it. And you're right on one thing, Tim Costello, there are millions, tens of millions, I would say hundreds of millions of people who would dearly love the opportunity to come to Australia. And of course, we can't manage it like that. We have to be diligent, and we have to do this in ways we can get a proper absorption of people so they can find a job and become successful parts of our community, as they do. And I've got to make sure that we don't go back to the old process, which is, I don't know how we had over 50,000 people under the Gillard, Rudd, Labor, Green, Independent chaos that just made their own arrangements. And of course, it just became anarchy. We had 17 detention centres that were set up. And what's that? That doesn't get less torture. It actually creates more. It creates a bigger problem.
Is this resonating as you're campaigning in the electorate? Do you believe it's going to be a decisive issue in the election campaign?
I'll be frank, it's not a decisive issue unless you let people start coming back in. Then it becomes a decisive issue. I was at the Nundle dog races today. It wasn't brought up once because they believe we've got control of the situation again. If you have the situation out of control, then they'll start bringing up to you at the Nundle dog races and at Bingra versus Manila in the league and at Guida versus the Barbarians from Armidale in the Union. That's when it'll become an item of conversation. But away from that, they're going to say, well, no, you've got that one under control, move on to the next issue.
OK, well, let's move on to your battle on the ground there in New England against Tony Windsor. Now, of course, when Tony Windsor won the seat as an independent, you know, he had a Conservative background, and no one voting for him then would have perceived that he was going to end up installing a Labor government and then backing a Labor Greens coalition to bring in a carbon tax and then becoming a darling of the Green left. So it should be easy for you to knock him off now because everyone up there knows what he stands for.
Well, I always take the political process with all the respect that it is due, and I'm taking this fight with all the respect that it is due. And there is a lot of other candidates, and I don't know how those preference flows will go, whether Mr Windsor will organise all preference flows to him. But you know, I always say the same thing. I'm confident, but I'm not cocky. I'll keep working. I've been working hard all today. I'm still here doing this tonight. It is one of the greatest honours to be back where I grew up and representing the people I grew up with. And I'll let Mr Windsor run his race and I'll run mine. To be honest, I think that the overwhelming view of those who are likely to change their vote is simply this. They've moved on. They recognise that there was a former member and he represented them in the past, and that's in the past, and they moved on. And what they're talking about is the future and where we go from here, and what we're going to do to make sure that we get the best delivery back to the New England, as well, and this is where the big difference is, as well as having a strong nation. I don't like the idea that you just talk about your seat. They say, no, we're better than that. We also believe in having a strong nation, and we believe that you should do your part as our local member to contribute to a strong nation, because if we haven't got a strong Australia, we won't have a strong New England.
Is Tony Windsor, though, seen in the electorate as a Green left candidate? He obviously talks a big game against coal mining and on climate action.
Well, I suppose that, you know, that once more is a question for him, but he is getting support from the Teachers Federation, and CFMU. I went up to a function the other day and I had the MUA stalking me. Now, that was a new experience, considering I was in Armidale 1,000 metres above sea level. But anyway, MUA here to stay, but not in Armidale anyway.
That is, they're moving inland now, the Maritime Union of Australia. That's quite incredible. Now, do you say Tony Windsor sold his farm to a coal mining interest and yet makes a lot of play opposing coal mines and talking about climate action? Do you call him out as a hypocrite on that action?
Well, everybody can make their own arrangements. They can drive down the road and go have a look. We have one problem with one coal mine in the seat of New England. It's at Werris Creek. Everybody knows the story. They know it. It's been done to death. They know it backwards. Everybody knows in country areas, people know the ins and outs of every story, and they know the ins and outs of that one perfectly.
OK, look, there was I'm going to go and promote my friends at Fairfax now. There was a wonderful profile piece written about you in the Good Weekend magazine just the weekend. People should go out and read it if they're interested in finding out a bit about your background. I loved hearing from your parents, Barnaby, Joyce, and it was interesting to hear that they're big fans of Malcolm Turnbull, and of course you've had arguments with them about this over the years because you've been a Tony Abbott loyalist. So as you're going into the campaign now under Malcolm Turnbull, do you concede your parents were right and you were wrong as a Tony Abbott loyalist, or do we not quite know yet?
It's those Sydney University types, Chris. All the same. They're all too clever. But look, our family had a very vibrant discussion about a whole range of things, and look, that's the great thing about a democracy. People can have different views. I'm a monarchist. My parents were Republicans, ardent Republicans. I think it's probably the most excited debate we've ever had in the House, and I give them half a second, they'll bring it up again. But look, that's the great thing. I think they believe both Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull are good people, decent people, trying to do the right thing. I think overwhelmingly most politicians are. You know, you might have different views, but it's really hard to find someone who you look across a chamber or look beside you and say, that person's a dud. They're not. They're just trying to do the right thing by their nation in a different way.
Barnaby, Joyce, thanks so much for joining us tonight on ViewPoint.
Good on you, Chris.